The methods section. What do you write in there? The methods section is probably the most important part of your article. So articulating it adequately is crucially important. So from writing about the data analysis that you've done and the cases that you've acquired information about, in this video, we'll look at how to write the methods section effectively. We're going to distinguish between research design and methods, and then we're going to articulate the findings of your methods section in a way that connects back to the literature. So stick around, and we'll have some practical exercises that are going to help you write a coherent and successful methods section. Hello, everyone. My name is Bogdan Popescu, and I'm an assistant professor of political science at John Cabot University, Rome. I also used to teach at Oxford and at Princeton. In my career, I wrote many academic peer-reviewed articles and one book. In today's video, we're going to delve into how to write the methods section. Okay, so we're covering today methods. How do we go from research design to methods? And how do we explain that how and why in our article? So I'm going to go briefly over what should be included in the methods section, what is a research design and how that is different from research methods. I'm going to explain the different kinds of research designs that are available out there. And then I'm going to show you how to apply, how to look at the model article that you've selected and how to identify the methods section and see how the authors are talking about methods. Okay, so the methods section should typically include answers to questions like, how did you do your research? What was the research design? Was it quantitative? Was it qualitative? So I'm introducing here a new terminology, which is the research design, right? So research design is fundamentally a structure, a framework. So here you can think about a case study, an experiment. So this is fundamentally the backbone, the skeleton of the methods section of a paper. So you can include in the research design portion answers to questions like, what data did you use and how was it collected? What are your key variables and how are they measured? What are the analytical methods that you applied? So here's a graph that kind of further illustrates or hopefully further solidifies the distinction between research design and research methods. So research design, once again, is the blueprint, the framework, and research methods are the tools. Okay, so it's also important to note that a good research design tries to accomplish both internal and external validity. So I'm going to delve more into this in a few slides. So once again, the design is the framework, the structure, the plan. So here you can have a case study, an experiment, whereas methods are the tools, the techniques. You can think here of interviews, you can think of quantitative analyses, and so on and so forth. Okay, so I mentioned the notion of internal validity. So this essentially means the extent to which you can be confident that the independent variable is the thing that causes variation in the dependent variable. So another way of putting this is the independent variable responsible for the variation in the dependent variable? What could be other causes that might be producing variation in the dependent variable? And then could something else have been responsible for the variation in the dependent variable? So these are essentially questions about other potential variables that could be confounding the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable. So this is exactly the point of the fourth question there. Could there be confounding factors? Okay, I also mentioned the notion of external validity. So what does that mean? This is the extent to which the insights from your findings can be generalized outside of your particular study area. So can the conclusions be applied more widely to other cases? Okay, so those are the two important concepts that I covered, internal and external validity. So research methods could be defined as the set of techniques that can be used for collecting and analyzing data. So you could have quantitative approaches, or you can also have mixed methods. So within quantitative approaches, these are typically good in order to make broad generalizations. This typically apply by their definition to a wide variety of cases. Qualitative approaches are very good at investigating concepts that are very hard to define, or maybe populations that are hard to reach. These are also called small and uh, research approaches. And finally, mixed methods are types of tools that combine the two, that have both a quantitative and a qualitative approach. Data sources for methods include already existing quantitative data. If you're doing quantitative analysis, you could run your own experiments, you could do surveys, you could do interviews or focus groups, you can do comparative research, both in a quantitative and qualitative framework, or you can collect archival data that you can use as data sources. Within the methods section, it's important to identify the units of analysis. What are your units of observation? Are you looking at people? Are you looking at countries? Are you looking at organizations? So it's very important to specify what your unit of analysis is. Okay, so the main research designs out there are comparative analysis. So this is a qualitative type of approach, experimental designs that are quantitative, and quasi-natural experiments that typically rely on observational data. So obviously, there are a variety of other types of research designs, including ethnography and participant observations, content analysis. I'm not going to cover them here. I'm going to mostly focus on quantitative research approaches. I'm actually going to have multiple videos just on the different quantitative approaches. I'm just going to briefly mention some hopefully helpful information about case studies. So a case study typically is a comparative analysis study, right? So it has to be situated within a broader theoretical framework, and small n comparisons typically entail the study of multiple cases. A case study could focus on one country, one event, one organization, but it's important that it is contextualized or is situated comparatively to be important beyond itself. So, what do case studies do? They typically apply theories to new contexts. They try to examine exceptions to the rule. So they look at exceptional cases. They sometimes try to generate new theories, but they also have to explain how they're applicable to other contexts, or they have to explore causal processes or mechanisms. So the relevant methodology here would be process tracing. Okay, so case studies could be used in things like interviews, surveys, ethnographic methods, focus groups. Case studies could also focus on text analysis of documents. So here's an example how case study could be done. So let's imagine we're interested in voting behavior in Britain, or public attitudes about the environment in Germany, or public attitudes towards immigrant and ethnic minorities in the Netherlands. These are all very good examples of case studies. You could also have small n comparative designs, right? So these are typically used in order to apply existing theories to new cases, to maybe develop new theories and hypotheses, or maybe to test existing theories by seeing some real world variation. Small n comparisons typically entail analyzing two or more cases in depth. And as I mentioned, they're very valuable in order to maybe elucidate mechanisms, so how an independent variable is connected to a dependent variable, or how to offer rich contextualization, like trying to understand the theory, the context in which an independent variable is connected to the dependent variable. it's also helpful to study hard to observe outcomes, right? So here you also have the distinction between most similar, most dissimilar research designs, or most different systems design. So what does this mean? This really refers to what kind of cases you're analyzing. So within a most similar framework, you want to look at cases that are similar in relevant ways, right? But then they're different than maybe one key variable. So for example, the reason for doing this is because this allows you to isolate the effect of interest. This is different from a most different, or most dissimilar research design, in which countries are very different in many respects, but share the same outcome, right? So this is helpful when you want to identify the same cause. So notice here the distinction between most similar systems design that are helpful in order to isolate the effect of one difference that makes the two cases different, or most different systems design, which is helpful in order to identify a common cause. Okay, so small and comparative designs from political science. So Lipset in 1959 wrote Social Requisites of Democracy in Europe and South America. Scotchbull, who wrote Revolutions in Russia, France, and China. Or Louis Beck, who focused on economic voting in Britain, France, Germany, and Italy. Okay. Another type of research design here are experimental designs, right? So this is probably the most rigorous causal way to identify whether your independent variable X has an impact on your dependent variable Y. So the reason why this is so much appreciated is because you can control who gets into the treatment and who stays in the control group. So the reason why this is valuable is because of randomization. In other words, you get to randomize who gets into the control and who gets into the treatment, meaning there won't be any confounding. You're making sure that it's by random chance that people get selected into the treatment group versus the control group. So here, the logic of an experimental design follows these 5 steps. So you have 2 groups, treatment and control. You randomly assign participants in the experiments to either the treatment or the control group. So you get both old and young people in the treatment and the control group. You get both genders in the treatment and the control group. You get different occupations in the treatment, the control group, and so on and so forth. Step number 3 is about measuring the outcome before the intervention, right? So before they're exposed, before people are exposed to treatment. Then step number 4 is about applying the treatment. And then step number 5 is really about measuring the outcome. So how are the people exposed to the treatment responding? Okay, moving on to natural experiments. So this is very similar to randomization or to an experiment. But what makes natural experiments different is the fact that the assignment to treatment is determined by some external exogenous factor, meaning some factor that's outside of the control of the researcher, right? So here the most important or the most relevant designs are differences in differences and regression discontinuity design. So differences in differences assumes parallel trends. This is the fundamental assumption behind differences in differences, the parallel trends assumption. And then regression discontinuity design is really based on the continuity assumption. I'm not covering these methods here in detail. I'll have different videos that cover these in more detail. So the logic for these designs is that they try to mimic an experiment run by a researcher, but without full control, right? So this is all about understanding the assignment mechanism, like how do certain people, certain units get selected into the treatment versus the control group. So But it's important to remember that all these natural experiments rely on important assumptions. For example, the fact that variation in the causal variable is independent of confounders, and this variation must be as good as random. So the key word here is random, exactly the way we had randomization in the context of experiments. The challenge, however, is that it's very hard to demonstrate, or it's very hard to guarantee that the way people were assigned to treatment versus control was random, right? So some examples of experiment, or some examples of natural experiments have to do with policy reforms only affecting some regions, or eligibility threshold. If you think about government aid, if you think about age in order to benefit from certain educational programs. These are examples of research designs that where you could apply differences in differences, or regression discontinuity design. So it's also important to note that these kinds of approaches typically have high internal validity, meaning you can easily or credibly associate the independent variable to the dependent variable, meaning you can trace the cause and the effect, but they typically have limited external validity, meaning it's hard to apply the same insights outside of that specific case that you're investigating. Okay, so now in terms of homework, or in terms of things to do, so let us pick up the model article that we identified. So if you watched the previous videos, you know that I recommended to choose 1 to 3 model articles that you'd like to imitate. So to take one model article and let's have a look at it. Here, you have to identify the language that the authors are using, right? So identify how the authors are talking about the data that they're using, the source of the data, where is it from, and to what extent do they acknowledge how novel it is, right? So take the model article and identify and try to answer those 3 questions. So here's my model article. Here's what I have in mind when I'm asking you to do this. So my model article is, let's say it's Murray 2014. So when it comes to the question of what data are the authors using, so I wrote for myself here is that the article is primarily a normative piece. It uses existing literature, theoretical arguments, and some secondary empirical evidence, such as studies on candidate backgrounds, legislative performance, and gender balance effects on policy and institutions. So once again, this study is not necessarily the most relevant when it comes to data analysis, given that it's a normative piece. So the data that Murray is using from previous studies based on Western democracies, particularly the UK, but also some secondary analyses from other countries like Mexico, France, or Sweden. And you have a bunch of scholars who are being mentioned in terms of novelty. So what's novel here is obviously not the data itself, but the argument is novel, right? And the framing is novel. In terms of, instead of promoting quotas for women, the author is proposing to look at quotas for men, right? So this is a new spin on gender quotas. So by looking at quotas for men, the author is proposing that we can reduce overrepresentation. So this means that the new framing is trying to shift the burden of justification from women to men, but also to challenge the myth of meritocracy in male-dominated politics. Okay, so use that. So spend some, I guess, 10, 20 minutes on this. So try to identify the answer to these 3 questions from your model article. So what data are the authors using? Where is the data from? And how novel is the data? Feel free to pause the video and then you can press play once again. So moving on to using the model article in an analytical way. Once again, take the model article and try to answer using 3 or 4 sentences the following questions. So 1, how are the authors analyzing the data? How do the results help answer the question? Are there any limitations to their analysis? What are the variables that the authors analyzed? And why did the authors choose those variables? So here too, you should spend probably 20 minutes on this. So here's how I answered this question. So how are the authors analyzing the data? So I'm explaining that so in my case, my model article, Murray 2014, the author is using normative political theory with an analysis of practical implications. He draws on existing empirical studies to show how male overrepresentation undermines meritocracy and quality of representation. So his approach is more conceptual than empirical, so it doesn't necessarily do the conventional quantitative analysis. In terms of how the results help answer the question. So here too, the analysis changes the spin on gender quotas by saying that we shouldn't look at overrepresentation by focusing on women. He argues that reducing the number of men would expand the talent pool and would improve the quality of democratic representation. So this is going to be helpful in order to answer the big fundamental question about how to enhance representation for all citizens. So in terms of limitations, so I guess one limitation that I identified when I was reading the article is the fact that there's no original empirical data. And then even if the article acknowledges it, that doesn't mean that measuring meritocracy is actually intrinsically objective, right? This means, that the article itself recommends further research into selection criteria, representation quality, admitting that redefining these concepts is a long-term and contentious process. And then in terms of what variables are analyzed, so here you can think of variables such as gender composition of legislatures, the candidate background, the perceived competence. There's also probably variables that have to do with the symbolic or substantive representation of outcomes. So these are all additional these are variables that the article is looking at. So once again, spend 20 minutes trying to answer these 4 important questions. So how are the authors analyzing the data? How do the results help answer the question? What are the limitations? What are the variables that they analyzed, and why did the authors choose those variables? So feel free to pause the video. So moving on to another task here, which is drafting your own methods section. So here you have to answer the following questions. What data are you using? Where is the data from? And how novel is it? Notice that not necessarily using the same questions, but these are important questions that you have to answer. Spend 10 minutes on this, or feel free to just keep adding to this as you progress in your research. And then the final thing for your method section is to draft the answers to these kinds of questions. So how are you analyzing the data? How do the results help answer the question? What are the limitations of your analysis? What are the variables that you analyzed? And why did you choose them? So try to answer these 5 questions in a way that's similar to how the author in the model article answered that question. Okay, so just some key takeaways here. So it's important to distinguish between research design and methods. So the research design is the framework or the plan for your study. The methods are really the tools that are used in order to collect and analyze data. It's important to remember that good designs have both internal and external validity. So internal validity has to do with the ability to make a causal connection between the independent variable and the dependent variable, whereas external validity has to do with the extent to which you can apply the insights from your analysis to other cases. So it's important to choose a method that's relevant for the question that you're asking, but also to be aware whether you have data to answer that question. Case studies and small end comparisons are particularly helpful to explain mechanisms. Experiments and natural experiments are very helpful in order to establish causality. So it's always important to try to explain what is the data that you're using, where did the data come from, how are you analyzing the data, and why does it help you answer the question. So those are the kinds of things that are worth keeping in mind from this lecture. I hope you enjoyed this video and you found it helpful. If you enjoyed the content, subscribe to my channel and give this video a thumbs up. Also, if you have any comments or any recommendations, feel free to type in the comment section down below. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next video.